Inside the winter village, community, survival, and silent nights. When the snow settled thick across the fields and roads, villages became islands in a white sea. Travel slowed to near nothing. Few dared leave their homes unless necessity demanded it. For weeks at a time, life contracted to the narrow circle of the village itself. This closeness could be a blessing, but also a burden. The medieval winter brought people together, yet pressed upon them with fear and silence. The village as a fortress. Each village prepared as though under siege. Just as soldiers rationed food during war, peasants rationed every loaf of bread, every handful of grain. Ovens were lit less often to conserve both flour and fuel. Smoke curled from chimneys only at certain hours, and the smell of baking bread became a sign of relief. Neighbors leaned on one another. If one family's cow died, others might share milk. If a roof sagged under snow, men came with axes and ropes to pull it upright. Survival was a shared effort, born of necessity. But this unity had limits. When food ran short, kindness thinned. Some villages expelled the very poor, orphans and widows, seeing them as extra mouths that could not be fed. Winter revealed not only compassion, but also cruelty. The sound of silence. With fields dormant and roads buried, much of the daily noise of summer, plows, carts, market calls, vanished. In its place was silence, broken only by the crackle of hearth fires or the howl of wind. At night, the quiet was even deeper. Darkness descended early, and without candles or torches, families sat in near blackness. They spoke little, saving breath and strength, or they told stories in hushed voices. Tales of saints, of heroes, of winters past. Storytelling became both entertainment and survival, something to hold back despair. Children in winter. For children, winter was both misery and wonder. They shivered in thin wool, their small bodies more vulnerable to hunger. Many did not survive to spring. Yet even amid hardship, children found joy. They played in the snow, sliding on frozen ponds or hurling clumps of ice at one another. Laughter rang in courtyards, a fragile defiance of the cold. Parents, watching, prayed their children would live to laugh again in spring. The hearth as the heart. In every home, the hearth fire was life itself. Without it, families would freeze. Around the flames, meals were cooked, clothes dried, prayers whispered. The hearth was the medieval sun, a glowing circle of warmth in the surrounding dark. Keeping it alive was a constant duty. Ash had to be cleared, wood chopped and dried. Sometimes embers were carefully banked beneath ash overnight so the fire would not go out. To wake to a cold hearth was to wake to dread. Relighting it in a snowstorm could be near impossible. Illness and weakness. Winter's chill was a breeding ground for sickness. Colds deepened into fevers, coughs into deadly lung infections. Without medicine beyond herbs, honey, or prayers, the weak often died. Churchyards filled quietly through the season. Graves were dug even in frozen soil, though sometimes bodies were left in chapels until the ground softened. Death was an expected visitor in winter. The balance of fear and hope. Despite all this, hope remained. Winter was feared, but it was not endless. Families counted the days by scratching marks into wood, watching the lengthening daylight with cautious relief. Each sunrise that revealed a little less frost was a step toward survival. Villages sang at Christmas, lit candles for the Feast of the Epiphany, and feasted on what little they could spare. These celebrations were not luxuries. They were lifelines, reminders that light still existed, even in the coldest months. The Winter Village. The medieval winter village was not simply a place of hardship. It was a crucible, shaping resilience and memory. Within those snowbound cottages, people discovered the strength of community, the cost of scarcity, and the fragile beauty of life itself. The nights were long, the days bleak, but together they endured. And beyond the silence and snow, the world waited for spring. Fires, clothing, and the battle against the cold. If hunger gnawed at the belly, cold gnawed at the bones. Medieval winter was not merely uncomfortable, it was a trial of endurance, fought daily with fire, fabric, and ingenuity. Unlike the modern world of central heating and thick insulation, survival depended on meager flames, smoky hearths, and layers of rough wool. The hearth as hearth. In peasant cottages, the hearth was the center of life. A shallow pit or crude fireplace burned wood, peat, or dung, depending on what the land could offer. Families huddled close to the flames, their backs freezing while their faces burned. The fire was both salvation and struggle. Too small, and the cold invaded. Too large, and precious fuel was wasted. Smoke often filled the room, stinging eyes and blackening rafters. Chimneys were rare luxuries. Most cottages vented smoke through a hole in the roof. The smell of burning wood and ash clung to hair, clothing, and skin. It was the perfume of survival. In castles, great halls roared with fire from massive hearths or central braziers. Yet even nobles were not free from chill. Stone walls held in damp as well as heat, and drafts swept through cracks. A feast by firelight warmed the face, but corners of the hall remained icy shadows. The struggle for fuel. Fuel itself was a precious commodity. Woodlands were often controlled by lords, and peasants could be fined or punished for gathering firewood without permission. Some collected fallen branches, others burned peat dug from bogs or dried animal dung shaped into patties. Deforestation added to the difficulty. In many regions, forests shrank, making fuel ever scarcer. A winter's worth of fire required planning, labor, and sometimes theft. Without it, death by cold was as real a threat as death by hunger. Layers against the frost. Clothing was the second shield. Wool was the fabric of survival. Sheep provided fleece, which was spun, woven, and layered into garments. Coarse woolen tunics, cloaks, and hoods insulated against frost. Peasants wrapped themselves in whatever they could, old cloaks, patched garments, scraps of fur. Nobles enjoyed finer cloth, lined with fur, dyed in rich colors, tailored for warmth and display, but even their silks and velvets required wool beneath. Footwear was simple. Leather shoes stuffed with straw or cloth to trap warmth. Gloves were rare for peasants, and many worked with bare, reddened hands in the cold. Hoods and cowls covered heads, for even then people knew heat fled quickest from the scalp. Beds of straw and fur night was perhaps the hardest battle. Fires dimmed and cottages turned frigid. Families omnipresent and Lord. Cold and the body. The cold punished relentlessly. Fingers cracked and bled, joints stiffened and frostbite nibbled at exposed skin. Coughs and chills spread quickly, sometimes developing into deadly fevers or pneumonia. The weak, the elderly, the very young, and the ill were most vulnerable. A single bitter night could mean death if blankets or firewood ran short. Families measured survival not only by their food, but by their fuel and fabric. The symbolism of warmth. Warmth carried symbolic weight. To offer someone a place by the fire, a cloak, or a cup of hot broth was to offer life itself. Hospitality in winter became sacred. Travelers welcomed into a hall or monastery found more than rest. They found safety from death as icy hand. Warmth was also a mark of status. A noble's fur-lined cloak signaled both wealth and survival. A peasant's patched wool, stiff with age, showed endurance in poverty. The cold made social divisions tangible in every garment worn. Cold, as a teacher, winter taught resilience. Children grew up understanding the value of firewood, the skill of mending clothes, the necessity of sharing beds and meals. Cold was a constant reminder of human frailty, but also of ingenuity. Every ember tended, every cloak repaired, every bundle of kindling carried through the snow was an act of defiance against nature. The battle. Unending. No one escaped the cold entirely. From the poorest serf to the mightiest king, winter seeped into bones, chambers, and memories. Survival was not comfort. It was endurance, purchased daily with sweat, smoke, and sacrifice. To live through a medieval winter was to accept the cold as both adversary and companion, an enemy that could be fought but never fully conquered. Winter sickness and the fragile body. If hunger weakened the body and cold gnawed at the bones, sickness often delivered the final blow. Winter in the medieval world was not only a season of frost, but also a season of disease. Without modern medicine, even the simplest illness could turn fatal, and the cold months provided fertile ground for fevers, coughs, and contagion. The winter cough. Among the most common afflictions was the persistent cough, a companion to the smoky hearths and damp air. Peasants who huddled in poorly ventilated huts inhaled soot and smoke daily. The lungs, irritated and weakened, succumbed easily to bronchitis or pneumonia. A cough that lingers today might mean nothing, but in the medieval winter it was ominous. A child who coughed through the night might not live to see spring. A laborer with pneumonia might waste away within weeks, leaving his family without a provider. The spread of fevers. Winter also brought fevers. Influenza, though not fully understood, swept through villages in waves, carried by contact in crowded homes or gatherings. Dysentery, born of tainted water, did not rest in cold months either. In the cramped, smoky conditions of winter, contagion spread quickly. Without antibiotics or true medical knowledge, fevers were mysteries. They were blamed on bad air, divine punishment, or an imbalance of humors. Treatments included bleeding, purging, or poultices of herbs, remedies that sometimes helped but often did little. Children and the frail. The young and the old bore the heaviest toll. Infants were swaddled tight, yet many still froze or succumbed to fevers. The elderly, their strength already waning, found the long, cold nights unbearable. A single infection, untreated, could sweep them away. Families carried grief as a familiar weight. Death in winter was expected. Parish records where they survive often show spikes of burial in the cold months, testaments to the season's cruelty. The plague's shadow. Though the Black Death erupted in the mid-14th century, plague outbreaks recurred for centuries afterward, often intensifying in colder months when hunger and weakness spread vulnerability. Rats and fleas carried the pestilence, and cramped winter quarters allowed it to flourish. The fear of plague haunted every cough, every swollen node, every unexplained fever. Winter made people fragile, and fragility was fertile ground for death. Folk remedies and faith against sickness, people turned to remedies passed down through generations. Garlic was eaten raw for its strength, honey spread on wounds, vinegar used as a wash. Herbs like sage, rosemary, and thyme flavored broths meant to warm and heal. Some remedies worked, others were born more of hope than science. Prayer was another cure. Families lit candles before saints, monks chanted masses for the ill, and holy relics were pressed to fevered brows. Healing was as much a matter of faith as of medicine, for to many, sickness was seen as trial or punishment from God. Communal danger illness did not remain private. A fever in one cottage could spread to neighbors, then across the entire village. Winter's close quarters turned households into breeding grounds. Weddings, feasts, and even church services risked contagion, though few dared avoid them. To live meant to gather, and to gather meant to risk. In times of wider epidemic, fear changed behavior. Doors were barred, travelers shunned, and the sick isolated. Villages became prisons of cold and suspicion. The quiet of death. When sickness triumphed, death was swift. Bells tolled in snowbound villages, their echoes carried through frosty air. Bodies were laid out in chapels, candles flickering beside pale faces before being carried to frozen churchyards. Graves had to be dug, even when the earth was hard with frost. Men swung pickaxes against frozen soil, each blow a labor of duty and grief. The dead were lowered into icy ground, prayers muttered through chattering teeth. Endurance of the living. And yet, the living endured. Survivors accepted sickness as part of the rhythm of life. Children were born, marriages held, fields prepared for spring. Death took many, but it did not halt the cycle. For medieval people, survival meant not only resisting hunger and cold, but also weathering sickness without despair. Illness might claim the weak, but the strong, through resilience, fortune, or providence, pressed on. The fragile body in a harsh world winter revealed the body's fragility. It showed how thin the line was between health and sickness, life and death. Every cough, every fever, every chill was a reminder of mortality. And yet, it also revealed the strength of the human will to survive. Families nursed one another, neighbors shared remedies, and faith steadied the heart when the body faltered. In the frozen silence of medieval winter, sickness was a shadow, but so too was endurance a flame. Faith, fear, and the search for meaning. In winter. For medieval people, winter was never merely a season of cold and scarcity. It was also a season of the spirit. The long nights, the stillness of snow, the ever-present threats of hunger and death pressed people to search for meaning. Faith was their shield, fear their companion, and ritual their attempt to wrest order from chaos. The weight of darkness. In Northern Europe, winter brought not only cold, but also endless darkness. Days shortened, nights lengthened, and villages seemed swallowed by shadow. Candles and rushlights flickered against the dark, their glow fragile and brief. For many, this darkness was not simply natural. It was spiritual, a symbol of evil forces pressing closer when the sun fled. Superstition deepened with the dark. Tales of spirits, demons, and restless dead spread in whispers. Every creak of timber, every howl of wind seemed proof that unseen forces prowled. Faith was not an ornament, but a weapon, guarding the soul as much as the body. The church as light. In this gloom, the church stood as beacon. Its bells marked the passage of days, its feasts broke the monotony of hunger, its rituals gave structure to survival. Candlelit processions, midnight masses, and the chanting of psalms filled both ears and hearts. Christmas itself was a paradox, a feast of joy in the midst of scarcity. Families gathered for warmth and prayer, even when their tables held little. The birth of Christ was celebrated not only as salvation for the soul, but also as a reminder that light returned even in the darkest nights. Epiphany, Candlemas, Lent. All these feasts punctuated the winter, giving meaning to otherwise bleak months. They did not erase the cold, but wrapped it in divine purpose. Saints and superstitions. When illness struck, saints were invoked. Saint Roche for plague, Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Blaise for throats raw with winter coughs. Families touched relics, lit votive candles, and hung charms to ward off harm. Alongside official saints lingered older beliefs. In many villages, people whispered of Yule spirits, winter demons, or fae that prowled the frozen woods. Charms of iron or salt were placed at thresholds, and prayers mingled with folk magic in the fight for survival. For medieval people, there was no contradiction between faith and superstition. Both were tools in a world where every storm and sickness felt like a battle with forces beyond comprehension. Fear of divine judgment. Winter hardships were not always blamed on nature. Famine, plague, or bitter cold might be seen as punishments from God. Preachers thundered that sin brought divine wrath, urging repentance in the freezing chapels. To confess, to fast, to endure, was to align oneself with divine will. This fear was both burden and comfort. If suffering was punishment, it also meant that survival could be redemption. Each act of endurance became an offering, each pang of hunger a prayer, each frostbitten hand a sign of piety. Pilgrimages and promises. Even in winter, some undertook pilgrimages. Wrapped in cloaks, leaning on staffs, travelers set out to holy shrines, seeking healing or protection. The road was dangerous. Snow, wolves, and bandits waited, but faith drove them onward. Others made vows, promises to saints, offerings to churches, fasts or donations pledged if they survived the cold months. These vows were acts of bargaining, born of desperation but rooted in hope. The comfort of daily ritual was survival of the soul. Morning prayers, grace before meals, blessings at night, each framed life with meaning. Families recited psalms together, monks sang in dark chapels, peasants crossed themselves before venturing into the cold. Even the act of lighting a candle became ritual. A flame against darkness, a symbol of hope against despair. The mystery of winter, with its silence and stillness, invited reflection. Fields lay barren, animals hibernated, and life seemed paused. For some, this pause was terrifying. For others, it was sacred, a time to draw closer to God, to meditate on death, judgment, and the hope of resurrection. In monasteries, monks embraced winter silence as a form of prayer. In villages, families told stories by the fire, weaving lessons of faith into tales of saints and spirits. Everywhere, winter became not just a physical trial, but a spiritual mirror. Faith as survival. For medieval people, faith was not abstract. It was bread when bread was scarce, fire when fires burned low, medicine when herbs failed. To believe was to endure, to find meaning in suffering, to walk through the frozen world with the certainty that endurance itself was holy. Without faith, winter was only hunger and cold. With faith, it became a pilgrimage of the soul. Each day survived a step closer to salvation. The search for meaning. In the end, medieval winter was more than frost and famine. It was a teacher. It taught humility before nature, dependence on community, and trust in God. Fear lingered, but so did hope. Amid the snow and silence, peasants, nobles, and monks alike looked upward, finding in the endless night not only terror but also the promise of light. Nobles, castles, and the illusion of comfort. When one imagines medieval winter, it is easy to think of peasants shivering in their cottages, while nobles lounged comfortably in castles beside roaring fires. Yet the reality was far more complex. Nobility lived with greater abundance, yes, but even in their stone fortresses, winter's chill crept in. Comfort was relative, and luxury was often an illusion. Stone walls and cold drafts castles looked imposing from the outside. Thick walls, towering keeps, sturdy gates, but those same stone walls that repelled enemies also absorbed cold. Without insulation, they turned chambers into damp caverns. Fireplaces roared, but their heat spread poorly. The corner of a great hall might still be icy even as the hearth blazed. Drafts slipped through arrow slits and unshuttered windows. Floors of stone chilled the feet, and tapestries, while beautiful, were as much about blocking cold as about decoration. Nobles wrapped themselves in furs, but the air remained raw. The noble diet. Compared to peasants, nobles feasted. Winter tables groaned under roasted boar, venison, pies, fish, spiced wine, and delicate sweets. Salted and smoked meats filled storerooms, while imported spices, pepper, cinnamon, ginger, turned simple dishes into luxuries. Yet excess brought its own problems. Rich diets of meat and wine often led to gout, indigestion, and other ailments. Physicians blamed imbalances of humors, but the truth was plain. Too much of plenty had its own costs. Still, the sight of a noble feast in midwinter was a powerful display of wealth. While peasants scraped bowls of pottage, lords showed their power by dining lavishly, proving that they could not only survive winter, but revel in it. entertainment in the cold. Winter confined people indoors, and for nobles, boredom was an enemy nearly as dangerous as chill. Great halls echoed with music, storytelling, and games. Minstrels strummed lutes and sang ballads. Jesters entertained with tricks. Noblewomen embroidered by firelight. Hunting also remained a favorite pastime, even in snow. Nobles mounted horses, hounds at their sides, and pursued deer or boar across frosty landscapes. To hunt in winter was not only sport, but a demonstration of wealth, for it showed one had both leisure and strength to waste on such pursuits. The illusion of safety. Despite their feasts and furs, nobles were not invulnerable. Sickness swept through castles as easily as through villages. Servants who tended fires or prepared meals brought contagion with them. Children of kings and dukes died in winter just as peasant children did. Sieges, too, could turn castles into prisons. Enemies sometimes chose winter to attack, knowing supplies would run low and morale would falter. Behind high walls, hunger and cold could become even sharper than in the open countryside. Servants and survival. Noble comfort depended on armies of servants. Cooks stoked kitchens, pages fetched firewood, maids aired damp bedding, and guards braved icy watchtowers. These workers endured the same cold as peasants, but with fewer rights. Their labor was the unseen foundation of aristocratic life. Fuel for fires, water for baths, game for feasts, all of it required endless toil. If servants failed, noble comfort collapsed quickly into hardship. Castles as symbols. Yet castles in winter were more than homes. They were symbols. Their feasts contrasted with famine outside. Their warmth stood against the shivering villages beyond their walls. The Lord's ability to survive winter in style proved his legitimacy. Hospitality was also a noble duty. Travelers, envoys, and guests found shelter in castles. To refuse warmth or bread was dishonor. Thus, the noble's hearth became not only survival for his household, but also salvation for others. The quiet of noble chambers. In private, winter nights were still harsh. Even kings wrapped in furs felt the bite of frost. Bed chambers grew icy, and though bed warmers chased the chill, breath still misted in the dark. Sleep came under heavy blankets, interrupted by the crackle of coals dying in the hearth. Luxury softened the edges of winter, but it never erased them. Nobles might eat richer food, wear finer clothing, and burn more wood, but the cold remained a constant reminder that even power had limits. The illusion shattered. Ultimately, noble life in winter was an illusion of comfort. Compared to peasants, yes, they lived well, but compared to modern warmth, even kings shivered. Behind their feasts and tapestries lay damp rooms, smoky air, and the same eternal struggle against frost and famine. Winter was the one enemy that respected no title. Whether in a hut or a hall, survival was measured not by wealth alone, but by endurance. The illusion of noble comfort was powerful, but it was still only an illusion. Children, games, and the fragile joys of winter. In a season defined by hunger, sickness, and cold, the laughter of children rang out like fragile bells against the silence of snow. Childhood in the medieval world was perilous. Disease, malnutrition, and hardship claimed many young lives. But those who endured found ways to make joy amid winter AS trials. For them, Snow was not only a threat, but also a playground. The fragile nature of childhood. Those who lived faced winters of frost-bitten fingers, coughs that lingered, and bellies that rarely felt full. Yet the resilience of youth shone through. Children adapted, playing in rags and bare feet, turning hardship into games. Parents knew the risk. They cherished each child, but also steeled themselves against loss. A cough could turn fatal overnight. A fall on ice could mean injury with no hope of healing. Childhood was brief, precious, and often shadowed by mortality. Snow and games. For all its danger, snow also brought delight. Children built figures of snow, slid across frozen ponds, and hurled snowballs in mock battles. Sticks became swords. Sledges fashioned from wood scraped over ice. Peasant children found play in the simplest things, chasing one another across snowy fields, carving shapes into frost, pretending to be knights or saints. Noble children in castle courtyards enjoyed similar games but with more toys. Carved sleds, wooden hobby horses, and skates made from bones strapped to shoes. For both rich and poor, winter's snow became a canvas of laughter. For a moment, hunger and cold were forgotten in the thrill of play. Lessons amid play. Games were not idle. They prepared children for life. Snowball fights mimicked battles. Sled races taught balance and endurance, and pretend hunts mirrored noble pastimes. Childhood was both joy and training, shaping future peasants, craftsmen, warriors, and mothers. Even in games, winter's lessons were learned early. Endurance, cooperation, and resilience. A child who laughed in the snow was also rehearsing the skills of survival. Songs and stories. Winter evenings, long and dark, became times of storytelling. Children gathered by hearths, listening to elders recount the tales of saints, heroes, and spirits of the season. Songs were sung to pass the hours, from lullabies to carols that blended Christian faith with older folk traditions. These stories and songs were more than entertainment. They were cultural memory. They taught morality, faith, and history, passing knowledge from one generation to the next. For children, they were also comfort, a shield of words against the howling wind outside. The burden of work. Childhood joy was fragile because work pressed hard even on the young. Children carried water, gathered kindling, fed animals, and cared for siblings. In winter, their labor was vital, fetching frozen water, collecting scarce firewood, or helping mend clothes. For noble children, education was the burden. Lessons in Latin, heraldry, and scripture, carried out in cold chambers with ink stiffening in its pot. Even play often ended in duty. Yet, even amid chores, children found moments to laugh, turning work into games. Carrying wood became a race. Sweeping snow became a chance to carve patterns in the white. The pain of loss. Winter was merciless to children. Frostbite claimed small toes and fingers. Fevers carried little bodies away. Malnutrition stunted growth. Families buried children in frozen churchyards, tiny graves marked with crude crosses. The grief was profound, but also common. Parents mourned, but they continued, for survival demanded it. The loss of children was woven into the harsh fabric of medieval life. Children's laughter was an act of defiance. To play in snow, to sing by firelight, to laugh with a mouth still half hungry was to refuse despair. Childhood joy did not erase winter's cruelty, but it softened it. For parents, the sight of children playing was hope embodied. If their little ones could laugh in the cold, then perhaps spring would come and life would renew. The fragile joys. Childhood in medieval winter was fragile, perilous, brief, yet shining with moments of brightness. Snowball fights beside hunger, songs beside sickness, laughter beside grief. In their games, stories, and songs, medieval children proved that even in the harshest season, joy could survive. And perhaps it was this joy, fleeting yet resilient, that gave their families the strength to endure the long, cold nights. Festivals, feasts, and the brief warmth of celebration. Winter in medieval Europe was long, cold, and often brutal. Yet it was also punctuated by moments of joy, ritual, and celebration. In the deepest darkness of the year, when hunger gnawed and frost clung to every roof, festivals emerged as sparks of warmth. Religious holidays, folk traditions, and communal feasts created rare oases of abundance amid scarcity. The heart of the calendar. Christmas. By the High Middle Ages, Christmas had become the most important festival of winter. Though not yet the lavish celebration it would later become, it was nonetheless central to community life. Churches filled with candlelight, choirs sang Latin hymns, and priests preached of Christ's birth, bringing hope into a cold world. Families, even poor ones, prepared special meals for the day. A goose or chicken might be slaughtered, bread baked with spices if they could be afforded, and ale brewed stronger than usual. For nobles, Christmas was a time of spectacle. Great halls decorated with greenery, minstrels performing, and tables groaning under roasted meats, pies, and wine. For peasants, though humbler, Christmas still brought warmth. To sit by firelight, to eat a meal richer than the daily fare of pottage was to feel, if only briefly, that the winter was less cruel. The 12 days of merriment. Christmas was not a single day, but the start of a season. The 12 days of Christmas, stretching to Epiphany in early January. During these days, communities paused ordinary work. Feasting, singing, and visiting filled the dark hours. It was during this period that traditions like wassailing arose. Villagers moving from house to house, singing and drinking to ensure a good harvest in the year to come. For nobles, it was a time of games, hunts, and courtly displays. For the poor, it was a time of togetherness, when the community itself seemed to wrap them in a kind of collective warmth. Wise beyond reach. Sweetmeats, roasted meat, honey cakes. Children watched wide-eyed, savoring each bite as though it were a dream. For nobles, the feasts were performances of wealth and generosity. Spiced wine, roasted boar, sugared almonds, and elaborate pies demonstrated status. Yet, even here, the joy of eating together was universal. Warmth through ritual festivals were more than food and play. They were rituals of hope, lighting candles at Christmas, singing carols, telling the nativity story. These practices infused winter with meaning. For peasants, the blessing of fields and homes during Epiphany symbolized protection through the harshest months. For nobles, elaborate masses and processions reinforced the stability of their rule and the unity of their courts. Through ritual, people reminded themselves that the cold and hunger were not the whole story. Winter had its own sacredness, its own cycle, which led inevitably to spring. The role of music and dance filled the winter festivals. Minstrels strummed lutes and harps in noble halls, while peasants sang folk songs around fires. Music carried people away from hardship, binding communities together through rhythm and melody. Dancing, even in frozen streets, warmed bodies and spirits alike. For a few hours, the cold outside and the gnawing hunger within were forgotten in shared movement and laughter. Light in the darkness. Perhaps the most powerful element of these festivals was light. Candles, torches, and bonfires blazed against the long nights. In churches, the glow of hundreds of candles transformed stone into radiance. In villages, bonfires roared, their sparks shooting into the dark sky as symbols of endurance. Light was not merely practical, it was spiritual. In darkness, light became hope, a visible sign that winter's grip was not eternal. The brief warmth of celebration. When the feasting ended, hunger returned. When the candles burned low, darkness reclaimed the land. Yet the memory of festivals sustained people through the rest of winter. Celebrations were more than moments of indulgence. They were lifelines. They reminded medieval people that even in a season of scarcity, there could be abundance. Even in darkness, there could be light. Even in suffering, there could be joy. And so the festivals of winter were not just events in the calendar. They were acts of faith, of hope, and of community. A collective reminder that humanity endures not only by eating and working, but also by singing, feasting, and rejoicing. The long road to spring and lessons of survival winter was never short in the medieval world. It stretched across months, sometimes seeming endless. By February, even the most resilient souls felt weary. Firewood piles dwindled, food stores thinned, and spirits sagged. Yet through endurance, ingenuity, and faith, people carried themselves toward the thaw of spring. The late winter hunger. February was known as the starving month. By then, the bounty of autumn had long been consumed. Grain stores grew dangerously low, salted meat hardened into stone-like slabs, and cheese and butter became precious luxuries. Peasants thinned their porridge with water, eking out every crumb of bread. For the poor, hunger was an ever-present companion. Some chewed on bark or boiled weeds. Others tightened belts and drank weak ale to trick the stomach into feeling full. Famine was never far away. Nobles fared better, but even their stores diminished. Game was harder to hunt, and exotic imports slowed during harsh weather. Winter pressed its hand on everyone, rich and poor alike. The toll on health. Late winter brought sickness in waves. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making coughs and fevers harder to resist. Wounds healed slowly, frostbite left permanent scars, and disease spread in cramped, smoky homes. Yet, people pressed on. Mothers wrapped children tighter in rags, fathers braved cold mornings to fetch wood, and healers prepared what remedies they could from dried herbs. Survival was not certain, but resilience was instant. Faith in the dark religion carried many through the final stretch. The church calendar offered guiding lights. Candlemas in early February, marking the midpoint between winter solstice and spring equinox, was celebrated long nights would end. For nobles, it was a chance to show piety and generosity by distributing food to the poor. Ritual and prayer wove hope into weary hearts. Signs of thaw. Even in the harshest winters, hints of change eventually appeared. Icicles dripped, birds sang faintly, and shoots of green pierced through snow. These first signs of spring felt miraculous. After months of darkness, life re-emerged like a whispered promise. Communities responded with gratitude. Farmers prepared tools, women mended clothing for field work, and children watched with awe as snow gave way to mud and grass. Lessons of endurance. Surviving medieval winter required not only strength, but wisdom. People learned to plan ahead, to preserve food, to ration carefully. They learned to share resources, to depend on neighbors, to find joy in small things. From peasants to nobles, each winter carved lessons into memory. Waste nothing, respect the cycles of nature, and cling to hope even in darkness. These lessons were passed from generation to generation, shaping cultures across Europe. The bond of community. If one family suffered, others often stepped in. Villages survived as units, sharing work, warmth, and food when possible. Communal solidarity was not just kindness, it was survival strategy. Festivals, storytelling, and song also reinforced bonds. They reminded people they were not alone in hardship. In shared struggle, there was shared strength. The eternal rhythm. Winter was harsh, but it was not endless. Spring always followed. Seeds would be sown, animals born, fields green once more. The rhythm of the seasons was a teacher of patience, humility, and resilience. Medieval people knew that life was fragile, yet they also knew that endurance brought renewal. Winter's grip was strong, but never eternal. What we learn today. To look back at medieval winters is to glimpse a world of extremes. Hunger beside feasting, suffering beside joy, despair beside hope. It is to see human beings not as victims, but as survivors, finding meaning and endurance in the harshest conditions. Their lives remind us of our own resilience. Though our modern winters are softened by technology, the human spirit that carried them through remains in us. The will to adapt, to endure, to find joy even in hardship. That is a legacy we inherit. The long road ends. And so, as winter loosened its hold and spring returned, medieval people emerged with scars, but also with renewed strength. Each winter survived was a victory. Each thaw a rebirth. The story of surviving a medieval winter is not only one of cold and hunger. It is a story of endurance, of community, and of hope. It is the story of humanity's ability to live, to laugh, and to endure, even when the world itself seemed frozen against them. For in the end, the lesson of medieval winter is simple. We survive not only through strength, but through each other, and through the unshakable belief that even the darkest season will give way to light. The first frost and the coming of winter. Imagine a medieval village at the edge of autumn. The fields are bare, their harvest gathered, their stalks broken and brown against the chill air. Smoke curls from thatched roofs as families begin to retreat into the safety of timber-framed homes. The The days shorten, the nights lengthen, and a palpable sense of foreboding settles in. Winter has always been a test, but in the medieval world it was more than that. It was a trial of survival, one that pressed against every man, woman, and child, demanding resilience, endurance, and faith. The first frost arrived like an omen. Dew that once sparkled harmlessly on the grass stiffened into ice, crunching underfoot. Farmers and peasants, experienced in the rhythms of the earth, read the signs. The time for gathering was over. What had been stored was all that could be relied upon until spring. In wealthy manors, granaries brimmed with sacks of grain, salted meat, barrels of ale, and wheels of cheese stacked high. Nobles feasted in stone halls where banners of red and gold defied the gray skies outside. Yet, for the vast majority, the peasants who lived in huts of wattle and daub, there was little comfort. Their supplies were meager, and each log of firewood was precious. The village prepared itself with an almost ritualistic urgency. Women spun thick wool into cloaks, men sealed cracks in their cottages with mud and straw, children gathered twigs and brush for kindling. Every hand had a task, for idleness in these days meant death in the cold months ahead. Animals, too, marked the change. Chickens ceased their laying, cows grew thin, and pigs, often slaughtered before the first deep freeze, were salted and smoked to last the season. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap of fat, every sliver of hide, every bone found use. The rhythm of survival was practical, but also ceremonial. A grim dance learned through generations of necessity. Winter was not only physical, but spiritual. The church loomed large, its bells calling the faithful to prayer. Priests warned of sin and suffering, but also promised redemption. The cold season was not merely a battle against nature, but also a test of faith. To endure was to prove one's soul as much as one's body. The psychological weight of winter cannot be overstated. Darkness pressed against windows long before supper. The absence of light made time itself feel altered, as though the world were suspended between waking and dreaming. Children asked questions. When will the sun return? Parents answered with stories, legends that framed winter as part of a greater cycle. Tales of St. Nicholas, of spirits that haunted the cold, of saints who brought warmth through miracles. And so, with frost crawling across the land, medieval people braced themselves. They knew what awaited: nights of hunger, mornings of frostbite, endless chores of fetching water, chopping wood, and tending to embers. They knew disease would spread in smoke-filled homes, and some would not see the spring. Yet they also knew something deeper, that survival was possible, that their ancestors had endured, and that through patience, faith, and community, they too might see the green return of fields. The first frost was not only the beginning of hardship, it was the beginning of endurance. It was the first step into a long, dark road that would test the soul, but also reveal the strength hidden within even the humblest of people. And so, as the last leaves fell from the trees and the wind sharpened its edge, the medieval world took a collective breath. Winter was coming, and with it, the story of survival would unfold.